You're very, very welcome, everybody. Obviously, the two teams and the guests and owners and parents and trainers and all the rest. My name is Tom Moran. Just to tell you why I'm here or what I am at, I'm former Secretary General of the Department of Agriculture and Food, which gives me the interest in all this. I'm currently the chairman of the Kerry Group, and I'm on the board of Dawn Meats and a few other bits and pieces that I do around the sector. So I was delighted to be asked to moderate this hugely important session, and I'm going to learn an awful lot from it. This is the first of the semi-finals, the two simultaneously. Just a small reflection on debating, because it's really flavour of the month at the moment. There's no doubt about that. I mean, there was a debate not too long ago in Atlanta, Georgia, which kind of did change the course of history for the next possibly 4, maybe 8 years. So it is important. Another one a couple of nights ago, and we'll see tomorrow how that changes the course of history on this little island. But on a more relevant level to what we're at, in my experience, both in government and now in private sector, the art and the skills that you all obviously have, having got to where you are, is just cannot be overstated. Whether you're trying to convince a client, where you're trying to convince a management team, a board, a critic, where you're marshalling facts and using every theatrical trick in the book to convince and to engage. That's what it's about. And it cannot be overstated. And like an awful lot of other things in life, you notice it in its absence more than in its presence. In its presence, you realise you've convinced. I think that's right. I think that's the right approach. And what has happened there is that great chemical exchange in a debating context. So what you've displayed by being here at the final stages is that. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that in action. The two teams, which you know each other, probably know each other's backgrounds and everything else if you've done all the research, but it's great to see the home team, SETU and UCC. To have got here is a big achievement. So you relax and enjoy the day. It's the 9th of this great event. Niall Brown and Paul Nolan and your own president here of the local college gave it its background. The initiative is a joint initiative between Dawn and McDonald's. McDonald's is a hugely important customer of Dawn's, not just here but abroad, and both share a hugely committed view of the sustainability and the need for it. The topic, well, you know the topic. You know the topic more intimately now than anybody else in the room because you've done the research for it. The two teams, the proposing the motion is the South East Technical University and opposing a UCC. The stance, as in all debates, other than the political ones that I just mentioned, the stance has been allocated at random. So it's not the views that are held deeply, it's the capacity to argue and engage on those views and convince. That's the key point. There's a Twitter handle, #Great Agri-Food Debate. I want to introduce the judges because we have very eminent judges here today. I'm not wanting to make you any more nervous than you might be, but just to know who these kind of cross-looking people are. Over there you've got Dale Cramond. Dale is the head of Meat Industry Ireland, which is the IBEC body, IBEC affiliated body that really represents the beef or the meat industry in Ireland in all its aspects. Does a bit of debating too, because all his job is about that, is convincing. Richard Clinton does a fair bit of convincing too, because he's the commercial director of Dawn Meats and engages with all sorts of people all over the world in his capacity. And then lastly, we've Russell Williamson here on my left, and Russell is the head of large corporates in the bank HSBC. So it does a bit of convincing as well, and the odd saying no to people. So that's really the format of the morning. You've all had the detailed rules, and you know the detailed rules more than anybody else, the teams, I've no doubt. I've read them loads of times, and I still probably wouldn't say I know them. But I'm aided and abetted by a timekeeper over here who'll keep manners on me and on you in the best possible way. The captains will open and close the debate, and they'll introduce their teammates. you know the period is 5 minutes each for you know all these rules. I won't go into them in the detail, but they will be strictly adhered to because of the nature of the contest. So I think unless there are any issues or questions, I think the best thing to do is, as your president said, let the games begin. So can I invite then the SETU captain Ellen from the proposing team to open. Ellen, there you go. Yep. It's all yours.
Good morning, Chairperson, adjudicators and members of the opposition. My name is Ellen Doherty. I'm a proud dairy and beef farmer from County Kilkenny and captain of the SETU debating team. I'm here today with my fellow teammates, Ellen, Saoirse and Edward, to strongly propose the motion that regulatory climate change policies are driving a wedge between consumers and farmers. Firstly, to define the key terms of this motion. Climate change refers to changes in temperatures and weather patterns. Climate change has been driven by human activities, primarily through the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, gas and oil. Regulatory policies are guidelines that are initiated and interpreted by governments as rules that are put in place and must be followed by law. Driving a wedge is another way of saying damaging a previously good or close relationship between two groups of people. A consumer is someone who buys goods, such as food, for their own use or consumption. While obviously a farmer themselves is a consumer, for the purpose of this debate, a consumer is not a food producer. A farmer is a person who works in agriculture to produce food through raising livestock or growing crops. In other words, to redefine the motion here today, consumers and farmers are becoming more divided due to the interpretation and implementation of climate change rules. Everyone, consumers and farmers, are experiencing the reality of climate change. Let's face it, farmers and consumers both want the same thing: high quality food that has been produced in a sustainable manner. However, regulatory climate change policies create intense pressure and an increased workload among the farming community on one hand, while creating unrealistic expectations among consumers on the other hand. Our first speaker, Ellen, will paint a picture to show how the wedge between consumers and farmers has grown wider over the past 30 years. Once upon a time, farmers and consumers lived and worked side by side, both understanding of each other and culturally aligned. Over time, regulatory climate change policies have forced farmers to change their practices, creating intense pressure within agriculture to comply with these policies. Saoirse will then discuss the reasons behind consumers' unrealistic expectations regarding food availability and the price of food, how they are driven by assumptions that farmers are financially protected, yet food prices are still increasing. The contradictory climate change policies are in fact what's driving up food prices, yet ill-informed consumers blame the farmers. Edward will describe how this wedge between consumers and farmers is getting wider. He will also highlight the impact that potential new policies will have on Irish agriculture, food prices, and most importantly, food availability. At the end of the day, consumers need farmers and food producers. Despite farmers' best efforts to reduce climate change by adapting to and implementing unending policies and regulations, all the consumer sees is increases in food prices without any real understanding of why those prices have increased. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you all here today to uphold the motion that regulatory climate change policies are driving a wedge between farmers and consumers. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges and fellow debaters, thank you for taking the time to join us here today. My name is Dawn and I am delighted to be this year's captain for University College Cork's Great Agri-Food Debate team. My team and I stand in strong opposition to the motion that regulatory climate change policies are driving a wedge between farmers and consumers. In reality, these policies are not creating a division. Rather, they are forging stronger connections and fostering cooperation between the two groups. To understand why, we must first acknowledge the deeply interconnected relationship between farmers and consumers. Farmers produce the food that sustains us, while consumers provide the economic foundation that allows these farmers to thrive. The mutual dependence has been a cornerstone of society for centuries, and it remains steadfast despite the challenges of climate change and economic pressures. Farmers are not just producers, they are stewards of the land, working tirelessly to feed the growing global population while navigating unpredictable weather, rising input costs, and the undeniable effects of climate change. These events not only disrupt agricultural productivity, but also push food prices higher, affecting both farmers and consumers alike. Government policies, particularly those aimed at mitigating climate change, play a crucial role in supporting farmers, ensuring sustainability of the agricultural sector. While it's true that regulatory policies can sometimes create short-term challenges, these policies are fundamentally designed to protect the long-term viability of farming and food production. These regulations, such as carbon pricing, emission reduction strategies, are crafted to reduce the frequency and severity of climate-related issues, stabilising food prices and protecting the agricultural systems from collapse. It's important to emphasise the climate change policies in the light that they do not drive a wedge between farmers and consumers. They do the opposite. By promoting sustainable farming practices, such as carbon-neutral farming, regenerative agriculture, these policies provide farmers with the tools, financial incentives, and support they need to adapt to climate change. The CAP 2023-27 aligns with the objectives of the European Green Deal, Farm to Fork, and biodiversity strategies, offering a unified vision that brings farmers and consumers together around shared goals of sustainability. This not only helps protect the environment, but also aligns with the growing global food production needs. Consider the Origin Green programme in Ireland, which promotes sustainable farming practices. The result is not division from this, but a strengthened relationship based on trust and mutual respect. Furthermore, it is essential to understand that climate change policies provide much needed support to farmers. These measures make it financially viable to adopt new technologies and methods that reduce emissions, enhance productivity, without jeopardising economic stability. Carbon credit schemes, for example, allow farmers to benefit financially while doing their part. These kinds of incentives align the interests of all, ensuring that nobody is left behind. Farmers are not passive recipients of these policies. They have a seat at the table while they are being developed. Policymakers recognise this, and they recognise the crucial role that farmers have in our society. As a result, many governments, especially at EU level, work closely with agricultural communities to ensure that policies are practical, equitable, and beneficial for all involved. Rather than creating division, regulatory climate change policies strengthen the bond between farmers and consumers by aligning their interests. These policies provide support and resources that farmers need to meet their growing demand. Far from driving a wedge, these regulations foster collaboration. Isn't that the world we should all be striving for? Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges, chairpersons, and members of the opposing team. My name is Lauren Jennings, and I'm here with my team today to strongly oppose the motion that regulatory climate change policies are driving a wedge between consumers and farmers. First, let's acknowledge that the impacts of climate change are real, and they affect both farmers and consumers. They threaten the stability of food production systems. In this past week alone in Cork, we have experienced firsthand the instability of a changing climate. From temperatures below freezing, with ice and snow, to torrential downpours and devastating floods, to warm sunny days. This is not a buzzword to be lightly thrown around. It is a very real problem that affects everyone. As such, regulatory climate change policies are not only necessary for protecting our planet, but are also an essential tool for ensuring a sustainable future for our agricultural sector, our farmers, and our consumers. The topic of this debate suggests that there is a wedge, but as someone who is both a farmer and a consumer, I simply do not see it. Regulatory climate change policies encourage collaboration between farmers and consumers by promoting sustainable agricultural practices. For example, policies supporting carbon-neutral farming and regenerative agriculture provide farmers with incentives to adopt environmentally friendly methods, which align with the growing consumer demand for sustainable and ethical food products. This shared goal allows for a mutual understanding rather than division. Consumers play a crucial role in the success of climate-positive farming practices. Far from being disconnected from farmers, consumers increasingly demand sustainably produced food, and they are willing to pay a premium for it. In fact, consumer demand for organic products, local produce, and eco-friendly packaging has grown significantly in recent years. This shift in consumer behaviour allows for farmers to align with the market trends. Policies such as the Teagasc Climate Action Strategy aims to empower farm families to adopt new technologies and production systems that will allow agriculture to reduce its carbon emissions by 25% by 2030, while maintaining farm profitability. This can provide a platform for dialogue and collaboration between farmers and consumers, allowing them to work together to find solutions. By bringing farmers into policy-making processes, we ensure that regulations are practical, effective, and tailored to the realities of agriculture. And as consumers, we can all benefit from a future where food is not only plentiful, but produced in a way that is responsible and sustainable for generations to come. Together, we are not only facing climate change, we are turning it into an opportunity to build a stronger, greener, and more prosperous future for all. Ultimately, we must recognise that climate change is a global issue, and the regulations that are being implemented today are part of a broader international effort to limit global warming and avoid the worst-case scenarios. Farmers stand to benefit from a more stable climate, while consumers benefit from lower volatility in food prices and a more resilient global food system. The notion that regulatory climate change policies are driving a wedge between consumers and farmers is misguided. On the contrary, such policies are necessary to ensure a sustainable agricultural future that benefits both producers and consumers. Thank you.
Chairperson, adjudicators, members of the opposition, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ellen and I am a proud beef farmer from County Westmeath, as well as a third-year agriculture student here at SETU. And I wish to second the motion that regulatory climate change policies are driving a wedge between consumers and farmers. Farming has been a native part of our culture for as far back as the times will take you, an era not so long ago. The relationships between the consumers and the farmers of this country was more than transactional, but was deeply intertwined, rooted in a mutual understanding of the cultural values our Emerald Island has to offer us. Let's take it back no longer than 3 decades ago, where consumers and farmers lived, quite literally, a stone throw from each other, sharing a hedge which enforced a strong sense of community and connection. It wasn't all about the exchanging of goods, but rather more about relationships that were built on respect for each other's roles within the community. Farmers tirelessly worked their land with the seasons and the challenges of growing and producing food firsthand, while consumers, many of whom lived hand in hand, understood their dedication and labour it took to put the food on their tables. The connections went beyond the food. It was about the experiences shared. Essentially, consumers and farmers were very close. However, as regulatory climate change policies forced changes in legislation over the years, putting farmers under intense pressure to comply with these policies, these changes often contradicted each other and in some cases were ill-informed. My grandfather, a second-generation farmer of his time, and many like him, were given grants over 30 years ago to remove hedgerows. Now, 30 years later, my brother, along with his generation of young upcoming farmers, are being asked to put them back in. Climate regulation policies forced farmers to drain their land. Now, these same policies are demanding that farmers engage in re-wetting practices. No wonder the consumer who cares so deeply about climate change is questioning farming practices and wondering what, if anything, the farmer is doing to mitigate against climate change. All of us farmers know that we have a responsibility to our families, future generation of farmers, local communities, as well as the wider society to minimise our impact on the environment. We have complied with policies and changed our practices and then often reversed those practices just to comply with regulatory climate change policies. But because the consumer is so removed from the farmer, both physically and psychologically, the consumer just does not seem to believe that the farmer is doing everything to play their part. In Ireland, we are legally bound to many international agreements, EU regulatory policies, as well as national policy in the area of climate action. These include the Paris Agreement, the Farm to Fork Strategy, which is at the heart of the European Green Deal, as well as the National Climate Action Bill. But these policies, future regulations and incentives will all impact how we farm in the near future and will have an impact on the consumer in terms of the price and the availability of food. Yet, how is the consumer expected to understand this? Many of the actions that farmers are being asked to implement and that are already being implemented are designed to reduce emissions. Amongst other actions, such as improving EBI, improved grazing management, more days at grass, improved animal health, incorporating clover, as well as addressing low soil pH, all contribute to reducing emissions. But all of these actions will drive up the cost and impact prices. Farmers have a long track record of adapting to change, and we will do it again and again to reduce our emissions and to adhere to regulatory climate change policies by creating a more sustainable industry. We need the consumer to understand that mitigation strategies that the farmer is committed to will also impact that consumer. Unfortunately, because of the wedge between the farmer and the consumer driven by these regulatory climate change policies, the consumer just does not understand the intense pressure that the agricultural sector is under. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, adjudicators, esteemed guests, fellow debaters, and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending today. My name is Sarah King, and my group and I oppose that regulatory climate change policies are driving a wedge between consumers and farmers. There is simply no wedge between consumers and farmers. Farmers and consumers have a shared interest in sustainability and reducing the impact of climate change. Many consumers are increasingly aware of and supportive of climate-friendly farming practices, as seen in the rise in demand for organic, locally sourced and environmentally sustainable products. A study completed by UCC indicated that up to 60% of consumers wanted more sustainable products. Farmers' business interests including producing food that meets consumers' needs and wants, otherwise their farms would not be able to survive and thrive. Regulatory policies promoting such practices can strengthen the relationship between farmers and consumers by demonstrating a commitment to addressing climate concerns together as a collective. Climate change regulations can therefore align with consumer preferences, creating a market demand for more sustainable, locally grown and eco-friendly products. This can open new business opportunities for farmers rather than putting them at odds with the consumers. Both consumers and farmers are widely aware that the challenge of climate change is a major threat to all stakeholders involved. People understand that policies are the way to ensure prevention of climate change. If we don't address the challenges with policies, then farmers won't have viable businesses and consumers won't have food on their tables. Trying to take aim at policies is not the correct route to take when they benefit both parties and ensure a future for all. The 2015 Paris Agreement aims to limit global warming and pledges that the world's average surface temperature will be no more than 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial levels. Exceeding this temperature would change the climate dramatically, leading to increased extreme weather events and impacting farms and food security. There are planetary boundaries and a threshold beyond which we put everything in danger, and it could possibly be irreversible. The policies are not there to drive a wedge, but to safeguard our future and protect us together as a society, the government, industry and farmers. Yes, we will not deny that it is difficult for farmers, but ultimately planet policy is good and protects the future of farming and food security for consumers. Consumers and farmers depend on each other, and there is a strong connection between them, especially rurally. Ultimately, farmers are the backbone of communities. They are our friends, family and neighbours. Consumers understand that farming is challenging and value the high quality produce they produce. Many farmers would say they feel an intrinsic connection to the land and that they work with day in and day out and show an appreciation and mutual respect for the environment. The relationship between consumers and farmers is positive. Irish consumers widely support local farmers, evidenced by initiatives like the Origin Green programme, which emphasises sustainable farming and showcases the collaborative effort between farmers, policymakers and consumers to meet the climate goals. This positive relationship highlights that regulatory climate change policies do not inherently create division, but instead foster shared values and mutual respect. According to an AgriAware survey, 95% of consumers agreed that Irish farmers play a crucial role in the Irish economy, while 89% of respondents believe Irish farmers provide quality, safe, traceable food at an affordable price for Irish consumers. The Teagasc Signpost programme and Grass 10 initiatives have aided farmers in introducing sustainable practices to improve their farming methods, and financial institutions have backed this. Ultimately, these policies improve farming methods, efficiency, improving farm profits and reducing environmental impact. A survey conducted by Ipsos MRBI revealed 60% of farmers believe increasing their farm's environmental sustainability would positively impact their income. Thank you.
Good morning, Chairperson, adjudicators and members of the opposition. My name is Saoirse Cassidy. As a matter of interest, I'm a forestry student, which allows me to take an objective view of this motion. Firstly, let's discuss an image of a farmer. As many believe to this day, that's a person with a pitchfork scooping up hay, or that food just magically grows on the supermarket shelf. But it's in fact not the case and is far from it. There is so much technology that goes into agriculture practice to provide food for our growing population and securing our livelihood. Farmers are entrepreneurs in agriculture. Entrepreneurs need to make money to stay in business, otherwise the positive impact on our land will cease to exist. My friend Ellen has painted a perfect picture of the disconnect that's happening between farmers and consumers. Let's be clear here, Lauren. Consumers have become misinformed. Consumers have become agitated. Consumers have been bombarded with conflicting messages about agriculture and climate regulations for years now. With the rise of social media and other platforms, there's a lot of misinformation. Like, hold on, are we taking data from Fox News? For example, consumers might not realise the true environmental or social costs of food. This aggression has spread like rapid forest fires with a clear end of destruction. Consumers are demonising farmers, saying they are to blame. This is entirely false. There's a lack of clarity. From unrealistic expectations consumers have put on farmers regarding food and price. This confusion has led consumers to have little or no trust in the farming community, such as what they can deliver, further straining the relationship that should be united. As far as the consumer is concerned, farmers are receiving subsidies to change their practices. So why then, Sarah, is the farmer protesting? And why then are food prices increasing? However, the reality is farmers are not making money from these rising food prices. Just recently, the Irish Cattle and Sheep Farmers Association stated that farmers are struggling to meet the bare minimum costs of production. Climate regulations are becoming the law of the land, but only when it comes to agriculture, not the consumer. Consumers are painting farmers out to be the vicious villain. This is not the case. The real culprit is regulatory climate policies that are forcing farmers to change their practices, drive up costs and limit production of food, creating a division between the farmer and the consumer, who does not understand why food prices are increasing. Like Lauren, I am not an agricultural student. I'm a forester. And as a forester, it's clear to see both sides of this argument. As a consumer and as a member of a land science community, over my course, I've become connected to the agriculture community, and I'm truly outraged by the mistrust our beloved farmer has had to endure, who grows and shapes our land to nurture us all, both farmer and consumer. Legislation is controlling the producer, not the consumer. For every action taken by farmers to mitigate against climate change, ask yourself, what have consumers done? For example, how many people here travelled here today to the SETU arena using environmentally friendly alternatives to their private cars? Because I'm sure you've seen the car park this morning, lads, it's pretty packed. And do consumers plan to move to electric cars when they purchase their next vehicle? Do consumers avoid short-haul flights whenever possible? A few have, but the vast majority have not. Consumers are expected to make significant changes to their farming practices, and regulatory climate change policies provide oversight and guidance to the agriculture sector. But where is the oversight for the consumer? What paperwork do they have to fill out? Consumers expect farmers to change their behaviour, then blame the farmer when the pressure becomes too much. And yet, the consumer continues to demand sustainably produced local food at a high quality, but demands it at a low price while refusing to engage in actions they can take to mitigate against climate change. No wonder the wedge is being driven even deeper between the farmer and the consumer. Thank you for listening.
So you identified correctly that conflicting messages, misinformation and a lack of clarity contribute to consumer perceptions towards farmers, but these are the actual wedges that cause tensions, whereas regulatory climate change policies aren't the culprit. In fact, consumers and farmers are often consulted in groups forming these policies, such as the Advisory Group of Sustainability of Food Systems in the EU policy.
Well, I disagree. I think the policies are contributing to the wedge because the farmer does not have a choice and they're being forced, unlike the consumer who has a choice.
Hello, judges, moderators, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lukas Jankowski. I stand to explain why we oppose the motion that regulatory climate change policies are driving a wedge between consumers and farmers. In an agri-food context, a climate-related policy can be a source of disagreement. However, this would involve farmer and government stakeholders as opposed to consumers directly. In fact, both historically and presently, government-farmer disputes are a common occurrence, some of which are around climate-related policy. In Australia, farmers have criticized the government for promoting carbon neutrality by 2050, while signing trade deals with less regulated countries. In the Netherlands, government-mandated nitrogen emission cuts have led to widespread protests from farmers who fear for their livelihoods. In addition, we can observe a tight-knit relationship between consumers and farmers, putting aside the idea of a wedge. More than 87% of Europeans cite a short supply chain as an important factor in their decision to buy produce. Consumer-farmer alignment via shared interests can also be noted. There is growing consumer support for local, sustainable farming, often creating direct connections between farmers and communities. In the US, farmer markets and community-supported agriculture, CSA, programs are thriving, illustrating that consumers value farmers' efforts to adopt sustainable practices. The examples mentioned illustrate limited discord between consumers and farmers. The motion proposes regulatory climate policies as grounds of disputes. Policymakers are responsible for implementing legislation, hence why the wedge lies between governments and farmers. Climate-related policies are not the single driver of a said wedge between the latter two stakeholders. Climate-related policies are a more apparent topic is global trade. This is evident in today's context as demonstrated by the EU-Mercosur trade deal, which is causing considerable turmoil, particularly among the agricultural sector. Introduced in 1991, the Mercosur is an economic and political bloc composed of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia. It seeks to develop a common market, bolster development and democracy. A free trade agreement was reached with the EU in 2019, but remains unratified due to farmer opposition. As we speak, EU-wide farmer protests are taking place to express disapproval of such trade deal that would seek the facilitated importation of agricultural and cattle produce into EU markets. This means Mercosur countries exporting an extra 99,000 tons of beef to the EU, with a 7.5% duty on top of the currently imported 200,000 tons. To put this quantity into context, after 5 years of phasing in, it would represent 1.2% of the overall EU beef consumption of 8 million tons per year. A key issue lies in the potential for increased competition for EU farmers. Lower production costs due to cheaper land, labor, and relaxed regulations in Mercosur member states would drastically depress EU market prices and hence impact profitability. Questions are raised on agricultural practices and environmental standards. Large-scale monocultures and of soybean and cattle ranching, for example, have been linked to deforestation in the Amazon. Increased trade in goods associated with deforestation and high greenhouse gas emissions conflicts with the EU's goals under the European Green Deal. It is argued that Mercosur states have lower animal welfare standards, for example, use of growth hormones and antibiotics, practices that are heavily regulated in the EU. EU farmers incur higher costs to comply with animal welfare regulations. This is not to say that all FTAs are detrimental. The EU common market itself is a trade bloc and facilitates the free trade of goods and services. However, even from within, the wedge persists between governments and farmers. The EU Green Deal faced criticism for its ambitious environmental targets, which farmers argue were implemented without sufficient consultation or funding support. Ladies and gentlemen, it is therefore evident that the true wedge exists between governments and farmers, largely due to conflict of interest. Thank you.
Is it not government that is implementing the policies, so therefore the policy is like the wedge, what the wedge has begun with, not the governments?
So the wedge would actually be linked between the policymakers, i.e. the government. So the Mercosur trade deal, the free trade agreement that I was mentioning earlier, that was mainly decided by the government with little to practically nearly non-existent consultation with farmers. And that's why we can see large opposition throughout the whole of the EU. So, for example, in France right now, I know that in Ireland, it's also affected many farmers.
Chairperson, adjudicators, members of the opposition. My name is Edward Hatton, and I'm a proud beef and tillage farmer from County Carlow. I've been listening to the opposition, and I'm in disbelief that they reckon regulatory climate change policy is not driving the wedge between consumers and farmers. Ellen and Saoirse have proven firstly there is a wedge, and furthermore is being driven by climate change rules, regulations and policies. However, if this wedge is already not big enough, possible future climate change regulations will drive farmers and consumers further apart. Small family farms live in fear of a potential carbon tax on fuel and fertiliser, putting pressure on their already diminishing returns. They will be forced to scale back their operation, lowering their production, leaving less income to pay their ever-looming overheads. Their only option is to demand a raise in food prices, an option which consumers no doubt will resent the farmer for, all while overlooking the politicians who put this burden on the farmers in the first place. Will future climate change policy be the straw that breaks the camel's back, one that will see the end of our family farms, leaving the consumer short of their sustainable local produce which they desire? Will consumers be so naive to think that their food imported from all corners of the globe is more sustainable than our local farms? Lauren and Sarah have brought up the issue of sustainable farming and organic farming in their speeches. According to the Climate Action Plan 2024, we need an increase of 150% in the number of organic farms to help meet our climate goal. Organic farming in Ireland has shown we can successfully grow oats and produce meat, but that is not enough to feed our population. We will rely even more on the importation of fruit and veg from all over the globe, resulting in carbon swapping to the transport sector and the countries which this produce comes from, where regulation may not be as strict. However, will the wedge be driven further when consumers see government policy allowing 57 million allocated to the organic sector in 2024? Contrary to Lauren saying consumers want organic produce, currently 60% of lamb and 30% of beef that organic farmers produce ends up in the conventional sector. Is this not proof that the consumer desires an affordable, locally sourced product rather than pay for its organic counterpart? Due to its nature, organic farming entails less production from the farm, demanding a higher premium for its product, which will then be placed on the consumer. Surely the wedge will drive further if the consumer is forced to pay this premium in years to come. Consumers have seen regulatory climate change policy as a double-edged sword. They see huge investment from government and EU policy going into farms across the country, while they see their weekly food shop rise in cost week after week. In 2008, the Irish government bailed out the banks. Will consumers see climate change policy as a bailout to farmers, resulting in a growth of their already present resentment? On the 27th of March this year, the Nature Restoration Law was passed across the EU. It is expected that up to 9% of Irish farmland will be affected by this and will have to be rewilded or re-wet. Consumers may look with resentment at this change, driven by climate change policy in a time where their food costs are rising out of control. On one hand, we see consumers seeing money being allocated to farmers for climate change prevention policy, all while their own grocery shop price rises. On the other hand, we have farmers undertaking these complicated and time-consuming schemes, all to stay in business and support their families. I mean, no wonder there's a wedge. Looking to the future, we need to remove this wedge. We need to go back to our roots and rekindle the connection between farmers and consumers. We can no longer leave this matter to ill-informed politicians anymore. We need to let consumers and farmers work hand in hand to drive the future. At the end of the day, we both want the same outcome, a sustainable product at a fair price, all without outside interference. Thank you.
On point of information, how can you say with such confidence that regulatory climate change policies do not protect small farms and local produce when major policies such as the CAP 2023 to 2027 dedicate at least 10% of direct payments to smaller farms, ensuring that they can thrive while meeting consumer-driven sustainable goals?
Well, I suppose we kind of have to look at the broad range of it. The consumer is seeing all of these payments going to the farmers, and yet their food cost is rising out of control. How can they do their shop and see in the title of the newspapers that farmers are getting this money and think that the farmers are taking all of the money and it's not being passed down onto lowering their produce?
Thank you.
In conclusion, we firmly oppose the motion that climate change policies create a divide between farmers and consumers. The true issue lies not in these policies themselves, but in the misinformation surrounding them. Take, for example, Ireland's Climate Action Plan, which actively supports farmers through financial incentives, diversification programmes, and the Acres Initiative, which rewards farmers for their environmental actions. Rather than fostering division, these policies provide a framework for collaboration between farmers and consumers. Also policymakers, they are involved too, all working towards a sustainable and resilient future. The protests, as mentioned, we see from farmers are often framed as opposition to climate policies, but in reality, these stem from a wider range of economic pressures, many of which have little to nothing to do with climate action. As highlighted by the EFCSN's Fertile Grounds for Misinformation report, the narrative surrounding these protests have shifted, with many farmers now voicing their frustration over the broader challenges they face. Interests, rather than climate policies, are a key factor driving the wedge between farmers and consumers. Chains leverage their market dominance to impose unfair pricing, squeezing farmers' margins and pushing them towards unsustainable methods. Climate change policies, however, are specifically designed to help farmers navigate these challenges and improve long-term sustainability. Yet, these external pressures often get misinterpreted as being caused by climate regulations. Furthermore, the relationship between farmers and consumers remains strong, particularly in rural communities, where there is a deep mutual respect. Consumers understand the daily challenges of farming, the unpredictable weather, rising input costs, and fluctuating market conditions. Many consumers have direct ties to farmers. Peers, family, neighbours, or community organisations. That's how they meet. This connection fosters empathy and trust. It is true that consumers increasingly prioritise high quality, sustainably produced food, and as the demand grows for organic, locally sourced and environmentally friendly produce, climate policies are aligned with these consumer values, creating a direct bridge, and not a wedge, between farming practices and consumer choices. Regulatory climate policies not only aim to tackle climate change, but also seek to improve transparency, educating consumers about the real challenges that the farmers face in adopting sustainable practices. When consumers understand these challenges, it strengthens the sense of community and shared responsibility, bridging any perceived gaps and educating them on this misinformation. Moreover, these policies include people who rely on everyone else for food. They include everyone. They include financial support, subsidies, and technical resources that allow farmers to adopt climate-friendly practices without jeopardising their own livelihoods. Ultimately, the reality is this: climate change policies are a force for good, benefiting both farmers and consumers. By supporting sustainable practices and providing the tools that farmers need to adapt, these policies ensure that we can continue to enjoy safe, nutritious and high-quality food, while protecting the planet, not only of ours, but of our future generations. The wedge between farmers and consumers is not a consequence of climate action, but a result of misinformation, manipulation, and the external market pressures. If we focus on the truth, and if we work together, farmers can thrive, consumers will be satisfied, and the environment will be protected for all. Thank you.
Chairperson, adjudicators, members of the opposition, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to have the opportunity to address you all once again following this interesting and lively debate between our two universities. The opposition team from UCC have made one or two good points in this debate. However, overall, they have failed to convince us that regulatory climate change policies are not driving a wedge between farmers and consumers. As Eamon Ryan said at COP29 last week, climate change affects us all. The SETU team firmly believe that both the farmer and the consumer are on the same page when it comes to the importance of slowing down climate change. However, successive regulatory climate change policies over the past 30 years have been patchy, occasional, and oftentimes downright contradictory in demanding changes in farming practices, all the while as climate change has continued unabated. No wonder there is a wedge between consumers and farmers. Consumers expect food at low prices. The farmers cannot produce food at these low prices due to the implementation of climate change regulatory policies. Despite what Alva said about policies bringing consumers together, Ellen spoke about how the wedge has driven by these policies over the past 30 years, causing undue pressures within the agricultural community. Farmers have complied with the regulations and oftentimes have had to reverse their practices due to new policies being adopted. To completely rebut Lauren's argument, Saoirse showed us this wedge from another angle, from the point of view of the consumer, who have unrealistic expectations of the farmer, expecting a continuous supply of sustainably produced food, but at continued low prices. She also pointed out how farmers are entrepreneurs in agriculture, constantly adapting to change, and yet the consumer fails to take as many actions as farmers. Farmers work tirelessly to feed the world, while complying with rule after rule, regulation after regulation. Farmers are willing to get involved with agri-environment schemes, such as GLOS, Acres and REAP. But what schemes or actions do the consumer get involved with? There are none. As Alva said, farmers have economic problems due to having to implement the policies, but this results in low outputs and high inputs, thus increasing the price of food. Despite farmers' best efforts to reduce climate change by adapting to the unending policies and regulations being implemented, the consumer is confused as they are still facing the realities of climate change. I completely disagree with the opposition's view of the future, especially Lauren's idea of increasing organics. Edward showed how this is not sustainable. There currently isn't a market for organics. Edward also outlined what the future actually holds if regulatory climate change policies put further pressure on the agricultural sector. He told us how Ireland's family farms are living in fear of being forced to cut back on production and at the same time trying to farm sustainably in a climate of rising costs. The opposition have offered us little by way of solutions to this problem. On the eve of an election, I am hopeful that our elected representatives will turn this wedge around and help to bridge the gap that regulatory climate change policies have created between farmers and consumers. Lucas pointed out several policies that have caused conflict within agriculture, but through more equitable laws and with commitments from both farmers and consumers, this wedge can be diminished over time. As they say in High School Musical, we're all in this together. The wedge is not permanent. Just like we can slow down climate change, we can bridge the gap between consumers and farmers. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you all to uphold this motion today. Thank you.
Just a few remarks before the announcement is made by Tom. Just to say, we were really impressed by the degree of preparation and the contributions from all the students here today, and greatly appreciate the arguments that were put forward. In terms of the contributions, they were insightful and you were eloquent in terms of how they were presented. And when it came down to it, there was a very, very difficult choice for us to make, but ultimately the scores were the scores, and Tom will announce the result in due course. So just thank you to all the students, because I know there's a lot of work goes into the preparation of this series of debates, and we look forward to seeing you all in the future. Thank you. And don't forget to send in your CVs.
So he's going to form a table outside, is that what you said? And then when he's finished, I'll do it for Kerry. Okay, well, this is the part now that I'm always nervous about, where I've got to announce the winner and the main speaker, or the Best Speaker Award. But before I do, because after I do that, nobody will listen to me. So I'm spinning it out specifically so that I get the full attention. I really want to, from my own perspective, congratulate both sides, not just on today, but on being here at the semi-final. It's been fantastic. The quality of that debate is something else. In fact, in my old job, I would set up another table for the Department of Ag. So I think the future of the sector, food and ag, is definitely. We spoke of optimism earlier. I'd be very optimistic with the calibre of the people that are going to win. Don't forget that debating skills are really applied in a very personal level in your interviews, because that's when you're really convinced and you engage, and I'd say you don't need to do much more. But on that note, I want to just read out this. Now, I better get my glasses on, because if I read the wrong thing, I'm going to be shot dead. But I want to announce the Best Speaker Award, and that's Ellen Ferry from South Eastern. Well done. Fantastic. Well done, Ellen. The team that's going to go forward to this afternoon's final after you've had your lunch is South Eastern. I really, really want to, and I will in a second, congratulate the winning team, but I really want to, I'm not going to say commiserate, but I want to congratulate yourselves from UCC from getting here, but also putting in a phenomenal performance. The length of time that you took to judge was highly indicative of the difficulty in the job. I know that for a fact. They would have been back in here like a shot if they didn't have to do that. So well done. There's always the next time. That's the old cliche. Congratulations, each and every one of you. Brilliant. You have the best speaker and indeed the team. All I can say is it's been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure to moderate at this. I wish you very well in the afternoon inside. I'm going to stay for it. And I hope you do too as well. And thanks again for participating. Thanks to the judges, phenomenal bit of work, difficult to know as it is. And to Helen from Dawn Meats as well for keeping me on the road. My timekeeper, brilliant, great at the bell. And thanks again.